Hi everyone, welcome to Andrea Speaks Out. My name is Andrea, and today I want to discuss a topic that is, in my opinion, critical for people to understand if we want to stop sexual abuse in its tracks. And the topic is about grooming. In case you aren't familiar with this word, I want to give a little definition first, but I really don't think a little definition is sufficient to educate people in a way that will really help identify what it is, what it looks like, or how it feels. And you really need to know all of these things if you're going to even put a dent into the overwhelmingly common practice of grooming. Okay, so grooming is something that predators often utilize when they sexually abuse a victim. It's a set of behaviors, really. It's a mindset, it's a manipulation, it's a process. It is the gradual crossing and blurring of boundaries between abuser and victim that can create this confusion, this false sense of trust, and this sort of a desensitization, really. It's a desensitizing emotionally, physically, sexually, so that when an abuser begins to, say, molest somebody, the lines have already become so blurred that oftentimes the victim isn't even aware that a new line is being crossed. Now, the timeline of grooming can vary greatly. In my case, my abuser groomed me for 2 entire years prior to crossing a sexual line with me. 2 years. By the time he first kissed me, he had become my closest friend. And I was so emotionally entangled with him that I would have done anything to protect that bond. I have heard many stories from other people where their abusers groomed them anywhere from like a month to a year or even longer. And I think what's important for all of us to know is what the behaviors look like so that we can recognize them and do something about them. When you're a victim and you're in it, you're really being the receiver of these grooming behaviors, it is so hard to recognize these actions as having any ulterior motives, especially if you're a child, And this is why the adults need to step up. They need to listen to their gut, they need to recognize those signs, and they need to speak out. So sometimes the abusers give presents. Oftentimes they do. They spend time with their victims, they take them to special events, they help them with their homework, they listen to their problems. They can build up their victim's self-esteem so much, paying them compliments, insisting that nobody will love them the way that they love them. The list can be endless, I swear. Grooming it's such a powerful tool, and it is really effective. Imagine receiving even half I just listed for 2 years as a lonely, needy teenager. How difficult would it be to lose all that? So what I want to do today in this episode is something a little different from my previous episodes. I want to share a bit from my book, Invisible Target. I spent an entire chapter discussing the grooming process because, again, I feel like it is so important for people to truly understand what it feels like to be groomed, what the behaviors look like. Now, Invisible Target, it's available in printed and Kindle versions, but I did not want to sit here and just read to you. I don't think that that's great for a podcast. So what I wanted to do, I decided to include an excerpt from my audiobook. Vanessa De Silvio narrated this book with such beauty and emotion. It's very moving. And I wanted to share this particular section of the grooming chapter because A, I share some of the feelings that I experienced back then. And B, this section addresses the ending of the grooming process, what it looked like to me back then, and how the shift occurred to crossing over into the secrecy of abuse. And also, one thing you're going to hear in this is that at the end of every chapter, I included a section called Consider This. And I just included discussion questions for students, for parents, for teachers and administrators and survivors, just to get the conversation going. So that's part of what you're going to hear coming up. So here you go. Give this a listen.
A month following the close of The Diary of Anne Frank, my mother went to the junior high to meet with Mr. Baker. She asked him to stop spending so much time with me. She told him that while she truly appreciated all he had done for me, she was afraid I was going to get hurt. Mr. Baker had acted shocked by my mother's concerns. He had reassured her that he would never willingly hurt me, but if that were her concern, he would, of course, back off. Years later, she told me that the thought of Mr. Baker doing something inappropriate had never even crossed her mind. She was simply worried I would develop a crush on my teacher and naturally get hurt as a result. Knowing my mother's difficulty with conflict, I imagined this was difficult for her. Later that day, I stopped by to see Mr. Baker, who appeared anxious and upset. He had 2 pieces of yellow paper with handwritten notes on both sides in his hand. I immediately thought I was in big trouble for something. The idea that he was angry or disappointed with me felt unbearable. As he read me the notes, I slowly got the picture of my mother's visit to him. She had never expressed any concern to me about the time I spent with him, and I had no idea she had even really noticed, so I was completely taken by surprise. How could anyone think about taking away the one thing that brought me relief and joy? Mr. Baker was the most important thing in my life. I felt semi-happy for the first time ever, and now my mother was trying to say this was a bad thing? I didn't think there was anything inappropriate about our relationship. He had never touched me or said anything of a sexual nature to me. I certainly didn't feel like I had a crush on him. He wasn't even cute. In fact, I actually found him unattractive. Balding, ugly mustache and glasses, just an old dude in my mind. But the beauty of his friendship outshone all of that in my mind. An unfamiliar anger bubbled up inside me. It felt like a grave injustice. I watched him put the papers aside, and then he made the following statement, which will forever be burned in my memory. "She's asked me to back away from you, and I guess I should abide by her wishes. But I've grown so attached to you, and I just don't think I can do that. I can't handle being away from you." After typing his words above, I paused for a good 10 minutes, completely struck by the contrast in my reactions to his statement as a 15-year-old kid versus a 45-year-old woman. My 15-year-old self felt shocked, excited, flattered, frightened, happy, confused, lucky, worried, guilty, and hopeful. Today, as a 45-year-old woman, I'm still shocked, but now I also feel sick, angry, repulsed, determined, nauseated, saddened, and worried. I was beside myself. Mr. Baker had grown attached to me. It wasn't just one-sided. This was difficult for me to grasp, but I believed him wholeheartedly. I wanted to jump up and down and shout, "Woohoo!" I mattered in the world, in this important man's world. This was the pivotal moment that completely hooked me to him. Nothing could ever make me walk away now. There was another feeling beneath this excitement, a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach, a gut feeling that was hard for me to identify. Just like many other times in my life, my body told me something about this was awry, but I had been taught to ignore such feelings. Today, I call this warning from my body a red flag feeling. These flags were always flying in my face, and I dismissed this one as well. I focused instead on all the positive feelings buzzing around my head and body. I was so caught off guard by his words that I was speechless, so he and I made an unspoken pact that he would forge ahead against my mother's wishes. Unfortunately, the request she made of Mr. Baker pushed us even closer together. Many teenagers rebel, of course. But up until this time, I had been doing exactly what I thought was expected of me. I didn't have any rebellious urges prior to this, and I don't think this was a case of acting out. This was honestly an act of desperation. I needed that man in my life to keep my depression and suicidal feelings at bay. I made the decision to do whatever was necessary to preserve his place in my life. I went home and shouted at my mother, "How could you take away my only friend?" I stormed out of the house and walked several miles to a friend's house. Meanwhile, my mother called Mr. Baker and said, "Well, now you've done it. She has run away. Are you happy?" Apparently, she had also asked him not to tell me she had made the request. Mr. Baker responded with concern that I had run away but acted innocent about our conversation. I ended up at my friend Karen's house, but then her mother drove me back to my place. It turned out that my mother at night, so when I got home, one of my brother's West Point buddies took me to a movie to get me out of the house, as my mother had arranged. When we returned from the movies, I walked into a little gathering of family. I needed to act surprised and happy, but inside I felt like I was so confused. With my years of practice wearing a mask during times like these, I came across as happy, surprised, and grateful, but inside, I was losing my mind. How had Mr. Baker become so important to me? Why was it wrong to be close to him? Why couldn't he be at my party? Secret meetings. After the confrontation, Mr. Baker and I started meeting secretly. I would tell my mother I was going to hang out with a friend, and then I would walk to the elementary school where he would meet me in his car. We would just drive around or go to an ice cream place a few towns away. Sometimes we went to an arcade in Framingham. Whenever Mr. Baker would drive me home from school, he would drop me off at the elementary school, and I would walk home from there. If my mom asked me where I had been or who dropped me off, I would make up something. I felt a level of familiarity, aliveness, and excitement in the secrecy. Secrets weren't new to me, and my mom hadn't really fostered honesty and trust between us. From early on, I got the message that secrets and shame and unacceptable behaviors were kind of the norm. It never dawned on me that hanging out with Mr. Baker in secret was something I should tell anyone about. For you, the reader, consider this. Extra attention, gifts, compliments, a caring ear, a common bond. All of these things made me feel incredibly special. Mr. Baker had found a way to fill my dark and lonely place. In my mind, he was my hero. I looked up to him with admiration and awe. I had spent so many days as a child praying to be rescued, and I believed he had done just that. This filled me with gratitude, and I felt I needed to repay him. It is no surprise to me that it was so easy for someone to gain my trust and admiration. I was begging for my father to love me, and parents' focus on me was such a welcome change in my life. If it hadn't been Mr. Baker, I am convinced someone else would have taken advantage of my neediness. I may have ended up with an abusive boyfriend, or I might have turned to drugs or stealing, anything to distract me from my pain. It just so happened that my void aligned perfectly with Mr. Baker's target practice. As a student, is there a trusted adult in your life you can talk to about your problems? What does an appropriate boundary with an adult look like to you? What is the difference between a caring adult and an adult who is manipulating you for his or her own gain? How can you trust your instincts when your gut tells you something is not right? Who can you turn to if a teacher is making you feel uncomfortable? As a parent, can your child talk with you about anything? Does your child have a teacher anything? Does your child have a teacher who spends time alone with him or her? What would you do if your child tells you that her teacher is her friend? Who would you go to with concerns about a teacher's inappropriate boundaries? What would you do if you have concerns that something inappropriate is going on with your child's teacher, but your child insists there is nothing to be concerned about? As an educator, what are appropriate topics for you to discuss with students? Do you think it is okay for a teacher to give a student a ride home under certain circumstances? To give a student a gift? Is there ever a valid reason for a teacher to spend time alone with a student outside of class? Could any of your interactions with students be viewed as inappropriate or questionable regardless of your intent? How would you react to a colleague spending a lot of extra time with a student? As an administrator, what protocols are in place to determine appropriate interactions between teachers and students? How do you address parents' concerns of suspected inappropriate teacher behaviors? As a survivor, looking back, was there a grooming period prior to the abuse? Was there a void that your abuser filled in your life? How is that void filled now? Are you able to meet your own needs now, or do you wish for another person to do so? The lesson here is to stop and think. There is a fine line between a teacher who is highly dedicated to his or her students and a teacher who has inappropriate boundaries. The safest practice for both students and teachers is to have an awareness of appropriate boundaries and guidelines for interactions.
So I hope that excerpt resonated with some of you. I hope that it helps describe the feelings that can be involved when you're groomed by a predator. I just thought being able to listen to someone share a part of their story may help bring to life some of this concept in a way that, that can make an impact that will create change, I want to continue this discussion. I really do. Do you have any thoughts about grooming that you want to share with me? Any confusion or anything? Just send me a message at andrea@andreaspeaksout.com. If you want to hear more from my audiobook, it's available on Audible and iTunes and Amazon. It's called Invisible Target: Breaking the Cycle of Educator Sexual Abuse. All right, I think it's joke time again. I bet you're all just so excited, aren't you? I had a hard time for some reason coming up with one for this episode. So this is perhaps arguably the worst joke so far, but it's better than no joke, maybe, perhaps. We shall see. Okay, ready? What do you get when you cross a snowman with a vampire? Frostbite. Ugh, I can't even fake laugh. Sorry, folks. It's bad. Okay, I guess that's my cue. That's it for this episode. Please subscribe and share and let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover, okay? I really appreciate everybody's support. I love hearing from everybody. It's wonderful. And all the sharing that folks have done with various episodes, all the messages I've received with feedback and suggestions, just thank you all. Have a great week, everyone. This week, let's try to be kind in our thoughts and our words. How about that? Let's keep our eyes open more. Let's listen to our gut and just be grateful for each new day. Sound good? Take care, everybody.